is all about uh, solutions of a quadratic equation by factoring. And by the way, I am Mr. Raymond Cruz, your teacher for today. Hi everyone. So before we start with the lesson, let us now have a short recall about quadratic equation. So definitely at this moment you already have an idea what a quadratic equation is. So a quadratic equation is a second degree mathematical equation. Why? So because the highest exponent of the variable in each term is 2. It is an equation in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, where a, b, and c are constants, meaning it is a fixed, or it has a fixed value, and the value of a is not equal to 0 or must not be equal to 0, since if a will be equal to 0, ax squared will also be equal to 0, and what will happen to the equation will become a linear function or a linear equation. So it has two types. The first one is a complete quadratic equation, wherein it is in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, and the other one is, we call it as the incomplete quadratic equation. It has two forms. The first one is ax squared plus bx is equal to 0, wherein the constant term is 0. And the other one is ax squared plus c, wherein bx is, or b, is equal to 0. Okay. What is a complete quadratic equation? A complete quadratic equation is in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, and that is what we call the general form or the standard form of a quadratic equation. We call it, sometimes we call it as the general quadratic trinomial. So it can be solved by factoring, completing the square. If factoring is not applicable, you can use completing the square. So there is another process on how to do completing the square. And if factoring and completing the square is not applicable, then you can use the quadratic formula. So that is why we have at least three methods in finding the solution of a quadratic equation. If one is, or if you cannot use the first one, you can use the second, and then you can also use the third one. For an incomplete quadratic equation, it is in the form of ax squared plus bx is equal to 0. Just like what I have said a while ago, the constant term c is 0. So this form can be solved by common monomial factoring. So meaning we have to determine the common factor between the terms, and then we have to take it out, and then that's the time we can solve the value of x. Another incomplete quadratic equation in the form of ax squared plus c, where b is equal to 0. So it can be solved by extracting the square root. So again, there is another process on finding the solution of an incomplete quadratic equation using extracting the square root. Okay, so we have the topic solving for quadratic equation by factoring. So we can use the table in factoring a quadratic equation in the form of ax squared. Ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0 if a is equal to 1. So take note, we can use this table by if a is equal to 1. Okay, so how to use the table? So in a quadratic equation, we have to look for the last term, the sign of the last term, so that is very important, and the middle term. So why do we have to look for the last term of the quadratic equation? Simply because it is the product of the last terms of the binomial factor. Okay, so as we all know, factor or factoring is the reverse process of multiplication. So if we will multiply two binomials, we can have a quadratic trinomial. Okay, so how about the middle term? The middle term tells us that it is the sum or the difference of the factors of the last terms. Okay, so let us take a look at the last term first. If the last term is positive, then and meaning that is the sum of, or the middle term is the sum. And if the middle term is positive, therefore both factors are positive. So again, we are talking about the last term of the binomials. Okay, and how about if the last term is again positive but the middle term is negative? So the positive or the sign of the last term indicates or tells us that the middle term is either sum or difference of the factors of the binomial or the factors of the last term. Okay, so again, if the last term is positive, the middle term is negative, so both factors are negative. And how about if the last term is negative? So it indicates that the middle term is a result of subtraction, or that is the difference of the last terms of the binomial. If it is positive, then the bigger factor will also be positive and the smaller factor will be negative. And of course, if the last term again is negative, that is also a result of a subtraction process, then, or that is the difference, the middle term is the difference. If it is negative, therefore the bigger factor will now be negative and the smaller factor is positive. Okay, so let us now have an example. What is the value of x that will satisfy the quadratic equation x squared plus 5x plus 6 is equal to 0? So let us have the solution. Okay, since a is equal to 1, as we can see, that is x squared. So definitely, the first term of the binomial is x. So we will just look for the last terms of the binomial. We will just look for the last term of the binomial. Okay. So number one, you have to check first the sign of the last term. So what is the sign of the last term? Okay, so that is positive. And to be exact, that is positive 6. The second step is check the sign of the middle term. Okay, the middle term is also positive. So that is positive 5x. Okay. So look for the factor of 6. That will give us a sum of 5. So the factors of 6, we only have two pairs. We have 6 times 1 and 2 times 3. If you will use 6 times 1, then you will have a sum of 7. But if you will use 2 and 3, you will have the sum of 5. Okay? So you will use 3 and 2 for our last terms of the binomials. So then the factors of x squared plus 5x plus 6 is equal to 0 are x plus 2 and x plus 3. Now, so we will not stop there, but instead we have to take the value of, or to solve for the value of x. So in solving for the value of x, we have to equate both factors to 0 and solve for the value of x for each factor. Okay, so x plus 2 is equal to 0. Okay, so let us now have x plus 2 is equal to 0 and x plus 3 is equal to 0. Then we have x is equal to negative 2 and x is equal to negative 3. So in solving for the value of x, given x plus 2 is equal to 0, we can use the different properties of equality. So in the equation x plus 2 is equal to 0, we have used the subtraction property of equality for both equations. So that is why we have x is equal to negative 2. So why subtraction property? Simply because we subtract 2 to both sides of the equation in order to transfer positive 2. Or we can also use what we call the transposition method, wherein it is being used, or it is a process of transferring a term to the other side of the equation. So since positive 2 will be transferred to the other side of the equation, then positive 2 will become negative 2. So take note that the the change in the sign of the term only applies if the term will be transferred to the other side. But if you will just transfer it within the side, then the sign will still should remain. Okay, so therefore the value of x that will satisfy